You start thinking about, well, what do you want your funeral to look like? Who might have to raise my son if I'm not going to be around?
Things Susan Rahn didn't think she'd have to face for decades. 3 years ago, that changed when she was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer.
I had had a clear mammogram, so this was completely out of left field.
When you heard the word terminal in your diagnosis, walk me through what that was like emotionally.
It was scary, very scary. Had to immediately start figuring out that we needed to get a will in place, and healthcare proxies and DNRs and all of those types of things that you don't even think about.
Rahn is prepared to fight until the very end. She wears a reminder of her strength on her wrist. But she's been given the facts by doctors and wants a say. She's a strong advocate for New York's End-of-Life Options Act, which would allow terminally ill patients like her a choice in their death. It would authorize the prescription of aid-in-dying medication to individuals with incurable, irreversible illnesses that have been medically confirmed to lead to death within 6 months.
I want to leave this earth in my home, in the arms of my husband and my parents.
Brittany Menard, the bright-eyed, beautiful newlywed from California, brought the Death with Dignity fight to the forefront in 2014. She was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor and eventually given 6 months to live. I spoke with her husband, Dan, who says Brittany wanted to spend her last months living. At the time, California didn't have a Death with Dignity law.
We packed up into a U-Haul. We drove up to Portland, Oregon. Brittany had to find a house for us to rent, a new medical team, say goodbye to our friends and family.
Oregon was the closest state with an aid-in-dying option. Brittany's story struck a nerve around the country and here in New York.
And so we started to think about, well, what happens to those people in New York who have the same problem?
Senator Diane Savino sponsored the End-of-Life Options Act, which is modeled after Oregon's legislation.
If you are terminally ill in New York State and you've exhausted all of your treatment options and you have come to accept the reality of your ending, you have really very little choice other than to wait around and suffer.
She's hopeful the bill will move through a committee by this session and be in place within the next 2 years.
We had no idea that this would be the amount of attention that it would stir, because from Brittany's side, all she was doing was sharing her story in the hopes that it would make an effect with, make an impact on legislators.
When she spoke out and shared her story with the world, I think it really changed the face of the aid in dying movement.
Brittany partnered with Compassion and Choices, a national organization that works to expand end-of-life options. It's the same organization Rahn is now involved with.
That happened, while I was going through my diagnosis and going through treatments. So, if it had not been for Brittany and her story and coming out with it, it wouldn't have been out there for me to really learn about it and be able to be vocal about it.
I think that we've seen over the past maybe 5 years, people become much more thoughtful about the death process.
Only 5 states currently have Death with Dignity laws. The one in California was passed after Brittany's death due to her and her husband's efforts. Almost 20 states, including New York, are considering Death with Dignity measures. Most data shows support for the idea of Death with Dignity legislation is high, around 70%.
Eventually, my treatment options and whatever clinical trials might be available to me are going to end at some point. My cancer will at some point take over all the vital organs, my brain, my liver, my lungs.
Rahn spends her days living, fighting, and speaking out in hopes of gaining more support for the Death with Dignity bill, which she hopes she'll get to benefit from.
I don't want to be in a bed where I can't communicate with my husband or my son, where they're the ones that are talking to me and I can't respond. That would be heartbreaking to me. It's not something that I don't want to leave that memory for them. When they think about me, I want them to think about the good times, the trips we've been on.
Now, just across the border in Canada, an 81-year-old terminally ill man became the first in Ontario to be granted aid in dying drugs. The Ontario Superior Court allowed this back in March. Since then, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has proposed officially to have a death with dignity legislation. Reporting live in the studio, Jen Schatz, News 4 at 6.
Tough to think about, but so important.